Hello, it appears we are going live. Sorry for the short delay. My name is Sarah Ewall-Wice, and I am a political reporter with the Daily Beast, and I am joined today by Justin Wolfers. He's a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan, and I'm super excited to have him join us live this afternoon. Justin, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure, mate. Now, you do know there'll be a test at the end of this.
Oh gosh, I hope I can pass. I used to be very good at math and somewhat good at economics, and I'll try and scribble some notes as we go. But listen,
Right.
I really appreciate you taking the time, and I also wanted to mention that it is your birthday, so happy birthday! I am putting that out there right now for all of our viewers.
Thank you.
And I called you out. Sorry, sir. And I also want to thank our more than 500,000 subscribers. We are live and we just hit that milestone recently. So we appreciate you all joining us. We're hoping to have a good conversation today. And we hope we can take some of your questions as well. So feel free to chime in. I will try and get to them a little bit later on in this chat. But we're talking all things the economy, policy. I'm based out here out of Washington. And, you know, there's a new poll, I'm just going to set it up here, that shows that 31% of Americans approve of how President Donald Trump is doing right now on the economy. A growing number of Americans, whether you support the president or not, have become increasingly frustrated about where the country is headed economically and about how their own personal finances are when we look at the cost of living and inflation and everything that's happening. But the president was asked this week what he would give himself when it comes to talking about the economy and what his grade would be. And he gave himself an A plus 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 when he went and talked to Politico. And Justin, I do want to just lay it out there, ask you, what would you give the economy when it comes to a rating, just based on the data and how people are feeling right now? Take me through what we're seeing right now in the economy.
Yeah, Sarah, so I'm sort of in a feisty mood. I apologise for that right up front. Could go lots of places. But why do we even repeat this nonsense? I mean, it's a totally serious question. Like, the president gave himself an A plus 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 plus. First of all, the president is not someone who tells the truth. Second of all, he's not the grader of this exam. Third of all, that's not a grade. What's the news there? What's the question?
Well, the question is, I mean, that's what he's saying and that's what he's putting out there to all these people.
Why do we repeat
But
nonsense?
because we need to come back and provide the actual context for what's happening. And that's why I'm asking you, I mean, where are we in terms of inflation as we go into the end of the year? He's been in office for a year. And what does the data actually tell us? Because we have all this on one end, and now we need to know what the actual reality is. And because people are feeling it, and it has come up over and over again as we see more and more of the polling here.
I love what you just did. So, look, there's a meta conversation, and I admit I am feisty here, but you just asked me a question about the economy by asking about the economy. You just said, what's going on with unemployment? What's going on with inflation? That's enough. A lying liar lied doesn't seem like an important preamble to me. But let me answer your question. If I were to grade the economy, I'm a generous grader. The US has had enormous grade inflation. Everyone gets a prize today. I'd give it a B. So it turns out in the American high schools these days, if you do enough to not screw everything up, you get a B. And that's where we're at. So the economy is not in a recession. I want to be clear about that. Could be very soon, but it's not right now. So what are some important economic metrics? So one is inflation. Inflation remains above the Fed's 2% target. It's around about 3%. If you strip out the effect of tariffs, it might be closer to 2%. But guess what? There are tariffs. And we didn't have to have them. So it's higher than it ought to be. But it's not catastrophic. Unemployment's been rising. This is one of the stories we haven't talked enough about. Unemployment has been rising very, very slowly. It's been rising maybe 1/10 of a percentage point every month or two. Not enough for anyone to notice, because that's the sort of decimal point logic that only nerds track. But if that happens month after month after month, before you know it, the unemployment rate's up to 4.5%, and it is. And now we're talking about stuff that matters. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about people who can't find work. One of the most important social, economic, political institutions we have, a source of not just income, but dignity, meaning, and so on. So we're not doing that well on that. The budget deficit, something else no one's talking about because it's not budget season, but let's talk about that. The budget deficit remains enormous. It's the sort of budget deficit that in ordinary times we would only have had if the economy were in a deep recession. It's okay to borrow money. You borrow money and spend more when you need to. But the idea is in calm times, you sock it away so you can hit the economy with a bit of extra juice when you need to. We're whacking it with juice right now. And I would like the president to defend that. If you were going to defend it, you have to say, well, it's because the economy is about to slide into recession. That, of course, is not the story that people are telling. Is that responsive?
I want to ask you. Yes, no,
Okay.
this is what I need. We're gonna dig into all of this here in terms of when you look at unemployment and where we're at. We have seen historic lows. There's a lot of questions about where we're headed, specifically on that. People looking for new jobs, looking for work, trying to change jobs. We've seen a lot of ups and downs coming out of the pandemic. When you look at 2026 going forward, what is the landscape looking, or where is it potentially headed at this point? There's been a lot of economic data that we haven't seen recently, because of that shutdown as well. So when you're looking at that specifically, what are you looking for?
Same thing I look for every year. How are we doing? What are my hopes, fears, dreams? So there's a betting market that allows people to bet on the probability the US will enter a recession. In any given year, there's roughly a 1 in 7 chance of a recession. That betting market currently says there's a 1 in 7 chance that we entered a recession in the last quarter of this year, in the last quarter. So that's sort of 4 times the usual rate. And it also says there's roughly a 1 in 7 chance that we enter a recession in the first quarter of next year. So again, it's normally 1 in 7 per year. This is 1 in 7 per quarter. So 4 times the rate. And we don't have betting markets beyond that, but there's obviously a lot of concern. Employment growth, we don't have the official numbers because of the government shutdown, but employment growth has really fallen quite dramatically. One part of this is actually quite easy to explain, which is there's this tremendous immigration purge. Fewer people are coming in and more people are being deported. Historically, this was a country that had growing population. So if you set up a shop on Main Street, the number of customers who might come to your shop has been rising every year just because there are more Americans. That's not going to happen in 2026. So first of all, that's going to shock a lot of people that they're not going to see the growth that they're used to getting. But it also changes how we think about economic statistics. There's a notion called break-even employment growth. I know you know it, Sarah, but let me back up for others. It's how many jobs do we have to create per year just to stay in place, to keep the same share of people in the workforce, to keep the same share of people unemployed. It used to be that number was we'd have to create 150,000 jobs a month just to stay in the same place. But that's because we had population growth. That population growth is gone. That baseline level of employment growth we need might be all the way down to, say, 30,000. Might even be 0. And if that's the case, we're going to see a year with very, very low employment growth. But it's going to be hard to tell. Is that because we're not growing enough or because we don't need to grow as much because we don't have as many Americans? And that's why one of the important things to do is going to be to change from thinking about employment growth to thinking about the unemployment rate, because that's a metric that's scaled by how many people want work. And so the big question is the unemployment rate rising? As long as the unemployment rate's rising, the American economy is underperforming its potential. That happened through 2025. The single best indicator for the future path of the economy is how it did last year. So it's been doing moderate. Maybe we got moderate again in our future. We'll see.
In terms of what's keeping people out of the workforce, why they're no longer looking for work, you spoke about that. What are the indicators there, or what specifically is leading to those decisions at this point in time as we're in 2025?
Right. So I just want to be clear. I was not suggesting people are dropping out of the workforce. I was suggesting there are fewer Americans. So in fact, if you look at prime age employment to population, look at people in the years where they should be working and see what share of them are working. That's actually been moderately strong. So that's another measure that's sort of like the unemployment rate. It's are people looking for work, finding work, and so on. And it's been okay. So it's not that people are dropping out and giving up. It's that there's just going to be fewer Americans. because there's fewer Americans or fewer people in America, we need less job growth to keep going. So it's purely about the immigration shock.
The immigration shock is one aspect of this, and I don't see the president backing off his immigration policy anytime soon. Maybe he does some very specific carve-out policy, but not overwhelmingly shifting gears. In terms of what would need to change, is it an overwhelming shift in perspective? I mean, we have 3 more years of this president. We're just at year 1. How do you see that?
So there are lots of different immigration debates to have. Let me start with high skill immigration, which is the H-1B visas. So a lot of the talking points are about, oh, I don't mind immigrants, I just don't like people here illegally. Well, people on H-1B visas are not. Those are folks who've shown that they're educated, they have a set of skills the United States needs. A lot of them are in science, computer science, and research and development. If you can't bring, and so this is where that story, I think one of the most important things is to talk about innovation. How does innovation happen? We have these incredible firms, often in Silicon Valley, which have access to the best PhD computer scientists from all around the world. If you look at the people who are inventing AI, they're from all around the world, but they chose to come to the US. The US is simply the best place to do that work. And we're able to do the work here because you can support them by making sure the engineers and the coders and so on, you have enough of them. If you talk to tech folks right now, they're asking the question, well, if I can't get coders in, do I send the PhDs abroad to where the coders are? So do I send the American PhDs to India? Or the other possibility is, why not just set up my R&D shop in Toronto? If it's in Toronto, it's the sort of place that Americans are used to. An American hotshot computer scientist is probably just as comfortable living in Toronto as in the United States. And the Canadians have already shown that they're going to be willing to bring in as much talent as you need. So there's very serious studies of this that have looked at past immigration shocks, and particularly to the H-1B visa program. And the thing is, the folks that are coming in are an integral part of our innovation economy. And so either the innovation goes elsewhere or we'll do less of it. That's not something you're going to see in next quarter's GDP statistics. That is going to be a new algorithm, a new computer program, a new approach to doing things, a new medication. It simply doesn't show up on the shelves. When that new medication doesn't show up on the shelves, it's also the case there are no American salespeople supported to sell it. And so it's a whole lot of opportunities that are simply not going to exist further down the track. So that's the H-1B side of things. We can come back to the illegal stuff, but then it's worth, on immigration, pointing to a couple of other things. So I teach at a university. Some of my students are from abroad. They fly into the United States and spend $50,000 a year on tuition. That $50,000 creates very good jobs. Right? It's not backbreaking work. You just stand up and teach. It's quite fun. They bring in a lot of money. They create very high quality jobs. It is literally an export. I'm exporting my services from America. So if you cared about the trade balance, it would be an important way of closing the trade balance. And it exports American soft power. Once you've come to the United States and gotten an education here, you know how we work, you learn what's wonderful about this country. But we're finding it hard to get foreign students. And it's because we can't be sure that they will be given the visas they need. So my university is literally a seller in the marketplace selling this incredible good. And we're being told by the federal government, we are going to make it harder for you to sell your goods abroad. This is not a tariff on imports. This is a tariff on exports. And it's pointless. So some people say, well, that's good. We want to save those spots for American students. If American universities have less money, what do you think that's going to do to the education we offer the American students? This is just a wonderful export industry that's getting shut down because of the xenophobia of the current administration.
So it's almost like you need to reverse how you look at this picture, because we do talk a lot about the tariffs coming in, but we're not looking at what we're exporting, and that is American innovation, is what you're saying here.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you on that front, when we talk about workers in the United States, a different look at this, a different topic, if you will, is AI and how that is also playing into this. And I want to ask you how that is expected to work into the unemployment, into the job growth as we move forward, because it really feels like we're in this AI boom, but are we also in a bubble?
There's a lot of questions there, so let me try and take. Let me start with the labour market one. So let me also just mourn the current moment. AI is, I think, arguably the most important transformation that's going to occur in our lifetimes in the labour market. That's a judgment. You're welcome to disagree. But it's the discussion we're not having. How should we adopt AI? How should we remake education? How do we remake our labour market? How do we remake jobs? And instead, we're talking about whatever blather came out of the White House yesterday. And so I think a great loss of the current moment is there are serious conversations being crowded off of the front row. So, Sarah, I'm so grateful that you're refocusing us on these important issues. So there are many different views. I am roughly of the view, actually, I'll give you an analogy. In the 1970s, Detroit auto workers saw robots coming for their jobs. And they were right. The robots came for their jobs and they took tons of their jobs, and some people stayed and work, and now what they do is they more or less guide robots. So how do I feel? I'm a white collar worker. Sarah, you and I and many of our audience are the same, which is we work in the knowledge economy. Your strength and mine is that we read broadly about what's going on with the world, and what we both do is we try and turn that into simple English. Guess what a large language model is really, really good at doing? Reading broadly and turning it into simple English. Sarah, I fear that you and I are Detroit auto workers from the 1970s.
I hate to hear that.
Yeah, that what we do is automatable. So that immediately gives you some grist for thinking about. So almost all technological revolutions in the past, things like automation, electrification, the steam engine, have been a substitute for brawn. They lift things up. They move things. They do stuff that otherwise would be done by big buffy blokes. And so almost all past technological innovations have hurt blue-collar workers. This is a cognitive revolution. You can disagree whether you like the word cognitive, but it's basically, it does stuff that white-collar workers do. So our blue-collar friends are probably looking at us right now saying, how's it feel now, mate? If we were less than sympathetic to what happened in the 1970s and 80s. So it's going to hit a different group. Now let's think about the inequality implications. It actually means it's going to hit the privileged. White-collar workers tend to be paid more than blue-collar workers. So that is a force towards greater equality. Now, not necessarily, because it could be that what happens is all of this means that we lose our jobs, but OpenAI does our job for us. And therefore, most of the economy is owned by Sam Altman rather than owned by blue-collar workers. And so there's, first of all, the distribution between labour and capital. And then within the distribution of labour, there's a distribution between white-collar and blue-collar. And then within the white-collar distribution, there's just think about your workplace. It turns out when there's been experiments run with AI at individual workplaces, it's been most helpful for the less productive workers. It can make a moderate worker good, but it can't make a good worker great. So therefore, that would reduce inequality within a workplace. So there's a lot going on there, right? There are estimates of the number of jobs that you can't ask the question how many jobs will be lost. It doesn't make any sense because jobs adapt, jobs change. Again, let me give you another analogy. There are as many bank tellers today as there were before ATMs were invented, which is kind of surprising. Because it used to be, if you wanted to take money out of the bank, you went and saw a teller and they'd count the money out. Now you go to a machine, it counts the money out, yet there's still someone inside the bank. What happened was the nature of the job changed. People within a bank very rarely count money now. What they do is they sell you sophisticated financial products. And that change occurred slowly enough that those folks could adapt and change, basically adopt the work that the machine couldn't do, which, by the way, is more interesting work than counting money. So in some sense, I'd say the adoption of the ATM was actually very good for the financial industry. It led to as many jobs, but more interesting and more highly paid jobs. So that's sort of the optimist's perspective. The pessimist's perspective is that the Daily Beast will be written entirely by computer, and that you will be working in a Detroit auto plant. But notice, I didn't say you will be unemployable, right? You still will have some skills, but they'll be brawn rather than brain, and you'll be using your brawn instead. That's the terrifying scenario here.
I'm curious about that. We do talk about how regularly in the newsroom how AI and Chat GPT, which I personally have never even used, though I feel like I might be behind on that front, especially when I talk to my younger siblings and cousins, and they're like, "Oh, we use it all the time, but not in journalism." We talk about how that is going to change our workplace. But another thing that comes into play here is generationally how the AI engagement is going to change with the generational change. And I'm curious on that front. You're saying it's a different type of work, not that you're unemployable, but we're also looking ahead and seeing that the boomer generation, there's many more people who are headed towards retirement, if possible. And I'm curious how you put the AI coming into the workplace next to the shifting generations as people start to retire. Is that something that you see progressing faster because of generational change, or how do you look at that when you see these two very distinct things happening in the workplace?
I mean, I think for those of our audience who are over 60, the good news is you're going to get to finish the video game before it gets destroyed. So if you're currently an interpreter, you probably have 3 more years of employment, and then there will never. But already the last interpreter has been hired. So I've said this to my undergraduate students: do not go and make investments in colleges if you're going to become an interpreter, because AI has solved that problem. It's done. So if you're old enough, it'll take a while to fire the last guy. You might just be there. I have something I love, Sarah. We have tenure in academia. So even as I'm a dinosaur who will be useless and replaced by machines, they can't fire me. So that's deeply reassuring. But as a journalist, you might be less reassured, because we know how media works somewhat differently. I think I don't think it's completely obvious. Let me actually sort of transfer the question a little to a word of advice for the audience. There is tremendous change coming to your workplace. It's easy to deny it, and it's easy to say, I found ways in which LLMs fail at things. That's all true. But I bet your boss can find ways in which you can do some of your work. And that's the threat. So my advice, and I literally meant it as advice, is become the most AI savvy person at your workplace. I didn't say go and become a computer programmer or a coder. I said become the most AI savvy, which in many jobs doesn't require a lot of work, right? I'm an economics professor. My colleagues are not using it all day, every day. If you're the most AI savvy one, you're the one who's going to help automate the future. You're extra valuable to your boss. You're the last one fired. And so my recommendation to you, Sarah, is become the most savvy person at the Daily Beast. And at the minimum, you will be the last person fired.
That is excellent advice, and it is something that I need to actually improve upon, frankly. I'll be honest there. As much as I love the writing aspect, I want to ask you, I'm going to completely shift gears here, because I'm looking at this in like different quadrants here, about another thing that Americans are looking at as we talk about the economy as big picture, and that is going into the holiday season. We're talking a lot about the cost of living.
Yep.
Employment, jobs, one side, inflation's the other side. Basically, I'm curious in terms of what you're looking at, because we've kind of shifted. We had a huge spike in inflation as we came out of the pandemic. We have continued persistent inflation, and you mentioned touched on it briefly. We talk about tariffs. When you look ahead to the next year, as people are talking about the challenges with the cost of living, what do you expect if we keep things as they are now? What can people expect in terms of the cost of living? And I'll dig further into some of the details.
Yep. Let me give you some good news and then some bad news. The good news is the amount of inflation that tariffs will cause is not astronomical. And we can do that just as with a little bit of math, just you and I. Do you like math, Sarah? You said
I used to love math. I'll be honest. It used to be my best subject, and then I started doing all this writing.
Well, let's practice some math. But it's partly because I want you to see the logic of this. Imports are roughly 1/6 of the economy. So let's say 15%. The average tariff rate maybe is 20%. So if 15% of the economy will see its prices rise by 20%, that means the average price will rise by. Do you want to do this part, or do you want me to do it?
I'm going to let you keep going, sir.
Okay, it's multiplication. Only a fifth of the economy, only a sixth of the economy is getting this 20% price hike. So therefore, on average, the average price level would rise by about 3 percentage points. And it turns out that not everything's getting tariffs. For instance, services are not getting tariffed. Steel, well, no, steel is definitely getting tariffed. British cars are not getting tariffed. So let's account for a bunch of that and say, instead of it causing average prices to rise by 3 percentage points, let's say 2 percentage points. It doesn't have to occur all at once. So let's say it's going to occur over 2 years. So if the price level is going to rise by 2 percentage points slowly, that would be 1% a year for 2 years. And if the average underlying rate of inflation is 2%, maybe that means inflation will be 3%, which is enough to be annoying, but not enough to cause a freak out. Right? So that's the good news. We're not going to see a return to 10% inflation. The post-pandemic inflation was because we were in an extraordinary moment. Every country around the world saw an extraordinary burst of inflation. It was crazy, right? Remember those dark days. Okay, here's the bad news. Normally, when we talk about inflation, prices rise and then your wages catch up. So, and the reason for that is if prices are rising, then the value of what you're producing, the price of what you're selling, went up. So therefore, the amount of revenue you're raising for your boss went up. And so therefore, your boss can afford to give you a pay rise. And in fact, it makes sense for them to give you a pay rise, right? That's why when prices rise, typically wages keep up. And that's actually what happened during the pandemic. Here's the thing. A supply-driven, which is a tariff-driven inflation, is when costs go up. Your boss now has to pay a tariff. The value of what you produced didn't change. The amount of dollars around the place that your boss has haven't changed. Your boss couldn't afford to give you a pay rise even if they wanted to. So what happens with the tariff-driven inflation is prices rise, but wages don't rise. And so this, by the way, is how we have a more mature and responsible conversation about tariffs. Look, the glib thing we say in the financial press all the time is the problem with tariffs is inflation. No. The problem with tariffs is they reduce your real standard of living, which is to say the price rises and your wages don't keep up. Now I want you to think about it this way. Let's say you're earning $100,000 a year. If prices rise by 2% and within a year your wage catches up, then that cost you $2,000 while you're waiting for your wage to catch up. That's annoying, right? Let's now say you're earning $100,000 a year and your cost of living goes up 2% and you're spending $100,000 a year. The cost of living goes up 2%. But it stays that way forever. That's costing you $2,000 this year, next year, the year after, the year after, the year after, and so on. Over the next 20 years, that's going to cost you $400,000. No, $40,000. So the point is, a tariff-driven inflation is very expensive compared to other inflation. And that's what I sort of worry about. And it doesn't all show up next year. It will literally be, we have lower wages for as long as the tariffs stay in. And if they stayed in 20 years, in this case, the tariff-driven inflation would be 20 times more painful.
We're expecting to get a Supreme Court decision on this next spring. With that said, there's a lot of questions. Even the justices were questioning, well, what comes next? Do we have to pay back the tariffs? Does the U.S. have to go back into the reserves and send out that money? That's a whole set of questions. But in a practical sense, if tariffs end, that doesn't mean costs drop. What would be, as we maybe pause tariffs, what would be your expectation for the cost of those products that are tariff moving forward?
Wait, I just want to, tariffs are a cost. So if we eliminate the tariff, costs fall. So every bad thing they caused on the way up gets undone on the way down. It's symmetric. So there is I suspect you're asking a slightly different question, but if I'm wrong, do interrupt me, which is, oh, great. So the tariffs are gone. A price is going to fall straight away.
Correct.
And the answer is not really, but eventually. let me try and explain. First of all, just generally, when costs change, prices change a little slower. It's just businesses have better things to do than spend all day changing their price tags. The second thing is businesses don't like changing their prices. Their customers don't like it. It's a hassle, takes management time. You got to walk around with a sticker gun and reprice everything. So they try to avoid it. So when there are temporary changes in costs, they usually don't bother changing their prices. They're like, oh, we'll eat it for a couple of days. Or if the costs temporarily fall, they're like, oh, it'll be extra profitable for a couple of days. You beauty. But if there's a permanent change in costs, then it's really important to change your price sometime soon. Why did I give you that background? Well, if tariffs are struck down by the Supreme Court, the question for management at your favorite supermarket the next day will be, are costs now permanently lower or temporarily lower? Now, Sarah, you normally do politics. If costs are knocked down by the Supreme Court tomorrow, is there a chance that Trump puts them back up the next day?
He's absolutely going to try.
Right. And so therefore, they're not going to believe this cost has gone away for a long time. And they're not going to adjust their prices until they believe that that's happened. And that's why prices are going to be slow to adjust back down. But it is basically true that in the long run, over a number of years, if costs fall, you expect prices to fall. And if costs rise, you expect prices to rise.
In that scenario, we're talking about the Supreme Court striking down these tariffs or them being taken away. I don't expect it to come from the Trump administration, but in some way moving forward. He has specifically issued some carve-outs, which to me indicates that he has identified that they are in fact a cost, as you mentioned, and the things like coffee that have gone up. He specifically discussed these, which is an omission to me that he recognizes and the administration recognizes. The Supreme Court, if they uphold
Can I pause you on that? Can I just pause you on that?
Sure.
You didn't need to wait for the president. You could have asked any economist on the planet. I don't care what the president's rate of learning here is. Tariffs are a cost. Tariffs are paid by Americans. That's not a question for debate. And, you know, I think the responsible thing is, you know, I understand and I appreciate your role as a journalist of bringing facts to the people. But the important fact is he doesn't change the laws of economics. They were written by, they're not his to mess with. They just exist. He doesn't get to deny gravity either. So, I mean, maybe that would be an interesting headline, but I don't think it's particularly interesting physics if he were to deny the existence of gravity, just like I don't think it's interesting economics if he were to admit that tariffs raise costs.
Mm-hmm. So, correct. I 100% agree with you. I recognize that as I riff here. With that said, if tariffs do stay,
yep,
and the cost remains up because they're a cost, what is the long-term projection here? Like,
right.
his whole argument is at some point you can repeal the income tax, all these other things, close the trade deficit. What does actually, what's the reality?
Right. So that's 10 minutes ago, we were talking about inflation, and I sort of pivoted to say what would happen is that prices rise and wages don't catch up. The other way of saying that is that the purchasing power of your income falls. That's the story. That's the mature, responsible way of telling a story. We can tell it, I probably made it sound a little bit like an economics class, so we can tell it in a more personal level. For the audience, if you have a grandparent who is alive, next time you see them, ask them how many toys they had as a kid. I asked my grandmother had 4. They were made of wood. They were beautiful, but she had wood. She had 4. And then I went downstairs to my basement and I looked at my kids' toy room. Sarah, do you have kids?
I do not.
Okay, well then we'll use my
nieces and
kids' toy
nephews.
room then, okay? And they have dozens of toys. And the question is, what changed between my grandmother's life and my kids? Well, it used to be that you would buy locally made toys made by local American carpenters. Now we import them from China, where they're made in incredibly efficient factories. And that is why my kids have so many toys. So if we put tariffs in, it would become more difficult, more expensive, and therefore future kids will have fewer toys. I want you to take that literally. Not literally. I want you to take that as a metaphor, right? That story of toys is trade with China is what delivered more toys to our kids. I understand some people are going to say, oh, it's all Chinese crap, blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to tell you, I'm a parent. I'm glad I can buy my kids more than 4 toys. And that same thing just plays out throughout society in all sorts of different domains where the food on my plate, right? Last night, what did I have? I had salmon that may have come from Norway. I had couscous. I don't know where couscous is from. Dill that may have come from Israel. Like just literally the plate every night. It's cheaper, it's more varied, it's more interesting. If you impose tariffs, you make it more difficult for me to do that. So that's the serious thing. Now, there's a second thing I do want to add, which is we will also fence off the United States from the rest of the world. When we trade with others, we meet with them, we talk with them, we exchange ideas. American cuisine has become incredibly, so much better because of the influence of immigrants. And if we put a wall around our country, we will be less influenced by ideas from around the world, and we will have less influence around the world. You might be okay with that. I think the president's okay with that. We have exactly one other country in the world that tries this. It's North Korea. I don't think it's working out very well for them. But, there are people who really do want a fortress America, and just be careful what you hope for.
On that front, not just a fortress around America, but if there's a realignment of alliances in terms of where other countries are going to get some of these things. So they don't want to do trade with the United States of America, but they aren't not going to do trade in general. And I'm curious how you see that shifting specifically towards how we've alienated some of our top trade partners in the United States with these on and off again tariffs constantly going. I mean, what's the shift that you're seeing now?
Yeah, so my favorite metaphor is a true story. It turns out in China, there's a chain of Texas barbecue restaurants. And people in China love going to a Texas barbecue restaurant. This chain of restaurants used to import American beef. American beef became very expensive when they put on retaliatory tariffs against the United States. They didn't stop eating Texas barbecue. They just imported the beef from Australia. So what happens as a result of this? American farmers just lost business. Relations between America and China and the role that we play and the influence we have on their economy fell. Aussie farmers are happier, and you've just pushed Australia and China closer together. That metaphor, I think, is playing out everywhere, which is you're quite literally seeing, you saw the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, set explicit goals for decoupling from the United States. It's not that he wants to do everything with Canada, he wants to go elsewhere. This is, and again, let me turn it from economics to something simpler. When a bully sits at your middle school lunch table, you put up with it for a couple of days and you give him your lunch money. And then you go sit at another table. Trump's the bully, the United States is the table, and everyone's off sitting elsewhere. They've found better, more reliable friends. To try to put it in sort of deeper intellectual terms, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what international trade is. People often use language like it's a competition. We're in a fierce competition with China. That's wrong. Trade is an act of cooperation. When someone in Norway goes fishing and catches salmon, they cooperated with me and they made my life richer and better. And in return, I might educate their child. And they end up smarter and I end up with better fish. And fish has omega-3 fatty acids that also makes me smarter. And it's a cooperative act. And so what do tariffs do? Tariffs prevent cooperation. And the moment you move out of this competitive frame to a cooperative frame, you start to see how this Fortress America go it alone thing means there's great virtue in cooperation. Everyone wants to cooperate. It's a deep human instinct. They're going to find people to cooperate with. It's just not going to be us, and therefore we become less central to the world.
In terms of how the U.S. is doing, you did mention, you touched on the farmers. There was the announcement of the $12 billion bailout, which is supposedly going to use tariff money to pay these farmers out. We've seen this something similar before. In 2018, there was also another farm bailout. Do you expect this to continue? If we go down this route, does this continue across multiple industries? And where do you see this hitting next, if so?
Right. So to be clear, I'm hurting from the tariffs. My Black Friday sales were worse. My Christmas shopping's more expensive. The furniture I'm buying is costlier. The gadgets I buy are more expensive. And there's a factory down the road that imports steel, and steel, or in fact, it uses American-made steel, but because foreign steel now has tariffs, American steel became more expensive because the American steel manufacturers jacked up their prices because they no longer face competition from abroad. And so they're worse off. And every single one of us across the country is paying this tax. But only the farmers, the soybean farmers, have that perfect photogenic sort of story of suffering. They're more organized, they're more politically relevant, they're more politically salient. And so Trump looks around at all the harm and the damage that he's caused, and he sees one group, and he says, I'm going to bail you guys out. And the thing that I think people should be mad about is, why am I not getting a bailout? In fact, why is my money going to soybean manufacturers? Now, maybe you're more sympathetic for those guys than I am. Fair enough. But the point is, there's damage everywhere. And what this is doing is it's allowing Trump to use his discretion to redistribute to particular favored groups. You ask the question, how far will this go? Well, that's a political question. Are there other favored groups the president would like to help? If so, are there the political means to do so? The one group we know that's politically most powerless is consumers, which is to say you and I, which is to say the audience. So we're last in line. So we're going to pay our taxes, and then those taxes will help out a bunch of people who are not us, who were hurt, and we still end up worse off.
Yeah, no, I do question that, because we did see a whole roundtable this week where he talked about his love for the farmers. And that is something we regularly see on the campaign trail, if you follow him across the country as I have, where he picks out a specific group and he essentially rewards them for their support of him. And so we start with farmers, and it becomes a question of where does it go next? I want to ask a question from our audience while we still have the time, so I'm pivoting
Wonderful.
completely.
Absolutely.
But I do have a question, and it is from a Robin, and they're asking me, what are the chances that we are heading for a depression because of President Trump? And then they said, serious question. I'm serious. What are your response?
Right. I don't think we are. By the way, if we were, markets would already have fallen. And if markets had fallen that much, you probably would have interviewed someone last week who was sure of it. So it's going to be hard to predict if there is one coming. I think there's a reasonably high chance of a recession. And certainly markets seem to believe that. But because I've been a bit feisty with you, Sarah, I'm going to be feisty with Robin just to show that I'm even-handed. I think, Robin, you're worried about the wrong thing. Because a depression is about what happens next month, next quarter, next year. And the truth is, not much can fall apart in a year. But what I worry about is deeper and more enduring. So let me back right up. Here's a deep economic question. Why are some countries, like America, rich and other countries poor? Very, very deep question. Very important question. I was born in Papua New Guinea. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. What's so different? Both are full of wonderful people. The best answer that most economists can come up with, it's something about our political and legal institutions, that in the United States we're a democracy, we protect the rule of law, we have contracts. If you were to start a business and it succeeds, then you'll get to keep the benefits. They won't just be stolen or nationalized. And that creates an incentive to go out and innovate and be an entrepreneur and so on. And so that then says the most important thing determining long-run prosperity is the quality of your institutions. What I worry about is some of those institutions are under threat right now. So without being alarmist, it's completely obvious that the president is after the Federal Reserve. He's said so explicitly. He wants to make it a political arm, which means it would serve his political interests rather than the best interests of the American people. He fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, suggesting that maybe he doesn't want statistical agencies that tell the truth. He has cut back on immigration enormously, suggesting that immigrants as an engine of innovation is not something he's interested in investing in. And the list can go on, and if you're more worried, you'd say democracy itself may be under threat, and January 6th actually seems to suggest that there's some very real sense that that's the case. We had the CEO of Intel walk into the White House and then walk out a couple of hours later, accidentally leaving 10% of his company behind, which in an earlier era we would of course called a forced nationalization. That's a very slippery slope. So the thing is, those changes are not going to show up next week. They're going to show up in a generation's time. And so do I think there's a chance that a single leader could destroy enough of what makes America great that in 20 years' time, there are a bunch of opportunities that are not open to your children that were open to earlier generations? That I am very, very worried about.
We've gone to a dark place.
Sorry.
It's fine. I want to just break down just one aspect of what you just said, because you laid out a number of different things there. Because it's been prevalent in the news recently, we are talking about finding as in the president is looking for, I should say, a next chair of the Federal Reserve. And you mentioned the threat of independence of the Fed. For our viewers who see that headline, see him going on and on about that, what is the threat specifically when it comes to the Federal Reserve losing its independence? Break that specific aspect down.
Great question. Thank you, Sarah. So I could tell you a lot of economic theory, but what I'm going to do instead is tell you a story. And just to get the spoilers out of the way, you're meant to listen for the analogies to the present moment. So, Turkey. A strongman, populist, came to power. Sound familiar? Erdogan. Erdogan has an idiosyncratic belief that low interest rates are good. Not supported by just uniformly good. Not supported by economic theory. He just happens to believe it. It's a very idiosyncratic belief. And Erdogan believes in himself beyond believing in any advisor, what other advisors or mainstream economists would tell him. Might also feel familiar. Erdogan was frustrated that the Turkish central bank was running policy in a way that would try and keep inflation low and unemployment low, and he thought they should just cut rates no matter what. And he wanted dramatically lower rates than anyone in the financial sector thought appropriate. Again, that should feel familiar. He was frustrated. He eventually appointed a loyalist to head the central bank. At this point, Trump appointed one of his loyalists as a member of the board. He's now talking about appointing another loyalist as the chair. When Erdogan appointed a loyalist, that changed the whole complexion of monetary policy in Turkey. Inflation started rising. What you normally do when inflation rises is raise interest rates to wheel the inflation back in. Erdogan idiosyncratically believes that low interest rates are always good, even when inflation's taking off. So they cut interest rates even as inflation's taking off, and every economist on earth says that's the wrong answer. Inflation went all the way to 80%. And eventually Erdogan was forced to admit defeat. The importance of that story is when a strongman populist with idiosyncratic views puts in place a loyalist to implement his idiosyncratic views that are at odds with mainstream economic theory, the consequences are not small. This is not will inflation be 2% or 4%. In Turkey's case, it was 80%, and it fundamentally changes the character of economic life, and has been tremendously expensive for Turkey. So that story says we don't want I don't want to see a populist strongman with idiosyncratic beliefs and a belief in his own judgment beyond anything that could reasonably be upheld. I don't want to see that story play out in America. But what we're looking at is the first steps of that story playing out exactly here.
In terms of where the Fed is at, we've seen some dissent. It's split on policy when it came to the most recent interest rate cut. It looks like we might be in a holding pattern moving forward, at least for some time, until we kind of see how the economy, the data plays out, if you will. What do you expect them at this point in time to be looking most closely at when we know, looking down the road, that there might be a new chair, but obviously the chair is not the tell-all be-all decision maker there? So how are you looking at the Fed in its current makeup versus where it might be next year, and what they should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so look, your job when you're appointed to be a serious and independent policymaker is to wake up and be a serious and independent policymaker, and I'm really impressed that the folks there have been doing a really good job. There are basically two paths for what happens next. One path is Trump appoints a loyalist as Fed chair, and that's it. So there's 2 loyalists, but there are 12 people who vote on monetary policy, and the other 10 are, I know, they're very serious economists who take the public trust seriously and take mainstream economics seriously, and they're not going to allow themselves to be bullied by a Fed chair who has marching orders from the president. Under that regime, I expect it to be the least powerful Fed chair in the history of the institution. They're just, the chair derives so much of their authority from their intellectual leadership, and if you don't have a real story to tell and real leadership to offer, you won't get that. The other possibility is that Trump gets just enough people on the board that he can actually flip the entire institution, and they would be run by a very thin majority of pure loyalists. At that point, you want to be looking at every other institution, whether it's the Corporation for Public Broadcasting or the Institutes of Peace or, the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice, and see what happens when the world is run by loyalists. So if that happens, the one thing I can tell you is the day after it happens, the bond market will, can I swear?
Go for it. We're online, I believe.
The bond market will shit the bed. And you will wake up to a set of headlines that you are very worried about. And you will be worried whether your firm can pay you next week. The markets are already right on edge about this Fed chair appointment. But if we were to lose the Fed as a serious institution, that means that lending money to the American government always comes with the possibility that they'll inflate it away, which means we don't want to lend it except at extremely high rates. And by the way, we owe the world a lot of money. So, the bond market will speak. The one thing, we've seen the bond market shit the bed once in Trump Mark II, that was Liberation Day, and he quickly reversed. So if he keeps doing that, we might be all right.
I want to just tag on to that because I did have a question from a viewer while you were speaking that it was specifically asked, at what point does the world stop buying our debt?
At the point they think it's a bad deal. But I think thinking about it in stops and starts might not be the right answer. Everything involves risk. I'm willing to bet on any horse if I get good enough odds, and I'm willing to buy any bond if the interest rate's high enough. And so, yes, it's true in developing countries. Sometimes literally they can't sell their bonds. My guess is we will be able to sell our bonds. But what it means is our national debt, which is roughly $30 trillion, the interest rate on that will be higher, which means there's less money for roads and schools and all the good things that governments are meant to do.
I'm switching gears one last time as we kind of come to our close here, because I wanted to ask you before I let you go specifically about the impact of the current healthcare standoff that we're seeing. Just because today we saw that the Senate tried to take action on extending the Affordable Care Act subsidies, which are set to expire. The enhanced ones are set to expire at the end of the year. This is going to, if this is not addressed by Congress, and it seems like we're kind of in a waiting pattern where Republicans on Capitol Hill have not come up with a clear path forward or the votes to move an approach to address this specifically. If premiums skyrocket at the end of the year, separate from the reality of people who are on the affordable, on Obamacare, the ACA, having serious challenges and potentially losing their health insurance, I want to ask you just a big picture question, why this impacts more than just people who are on the Affordable Care Act and in those insurance plans. What would be, in your mind, the larger economic impact and consequence of this healthcare cliff that we are facing in less than 3 weeks?
I'm not sure I follow all the details of the question, so I'm just going to choose which parts to answer. Sorry. So first of all, the cliff basically means that premiums are going to go up enormously. And that in itself directly is thousands of dollars a year for families that may not have it. Some of those are going to go without. Those families that go without, if they have a health emergency, will enter bankruptcy. They may still get treatment. They'll get treatment by turning up to the emergency room. Someone has to pay for that. And the answer is, if you can't tell who's paying, it's not everyone else. It's probably partly you. But the bigger and deeper issue is we were promised a healthcare plan moments after he walked down the golden escalator, which I think was 10 years ago now. And we've been told there's a healthcare plan coming in 2 weeks for literally 10 years in a row. And this isn't about scoring a political point. This is a genuine and profound responsibility. This is people's lives. This is the risk that one bad disease is the end to your family's current economic security. The most recent volley from the president has been, we will send people checks, as if that's somehow a healthcare plan. Let me explain why it's not. You can send me a $2,000 check and say, go and buy health insurance, but unless you force me to, I may not. Which means you can't just say, here's some money to go and buy health insurance in a market that may not exist. Folks for pre-existing conditions literally cannot get health insurance, or they cannot get it in an affordable way. And so what that means is we move back to the bad old days of lots of people not having health insurance. There's real, direct, important, profound problems for that family. Their kids may grow up in poverty because they got into a car accident. And then there are broader fiscal consequences because ultimately someone will foot the bill. So pretending that mailing someone a check is a health insurance plan fails to take seriously the reality. This is one of the most complicated markets you can possibly imagine. There's not a single economist alive who believes that markets, you can just let it rip and the market will solve the problem. There is not a country in the world that has a fully functioning health insurance market without substantial government involvement to solve the many different economic and ethical problems that this presents. America's not going to be the only one that ever solves it. And so I'm frankly just depressed by the tenor of the commentary that we still have people who want to destroy one healthcare system, but they still haven't figured out what to put in its place. And so I don't want to convince anyone that left-wing ideas or right-wing ideas are correct. But what I do want you to do is do not allow a politician to destroy something without a serious plan for how to put something back in place.
All right, Justin, that is a serious place to leave it. I think we had a really substantial conversation, and I would like to continue that conversation specifically on healthcare moving forward. I think we're going to have a lot of questions for however this plays out, be it that they do put forward a proposal 10 years too late, and actually move forward, or if we see the cliff and something comes in the new year. But I really appreciate taking the time to go in some of these subjects, putting on your hat and explaining it to me. And I really want to also thank our viewers, our 500,000 subscribers who joined us today for this serious conversation, an in-depth conversation on the state of the economy and a number of topics that are playing into that. So Justin, thank you so much. And for everyone else, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us.